Well, good afternoon. Welcome to session 7 of the 9th Annual Academic Symposium at Eastern Nazarene College. My name is Bill McCoy. I'm a faculty member in history, and I'm happy to welcome all of you to this afternoon's session. I know that for those of you who are in the audience, many of you have been with us in earlier sessions, and all of you, I imagine, have become experts in using Zoom. If you haven't been in any of these webinars, but you will notice that the configuration here is a little different in the sense that those of you who are attending this webinar can see the panelists, but you cannot see one another, nor can you speak directly, excuse me, to the panelists. But we did want to mention that there are a number of ways for you to interact. The primary way is by way of the chat function, which I do see that people are already jumping on. And certainly want to encourage everyone, if you, in fact, now would be a great moment if you'd like to send your well wishes to our panelists for today. Go ahead and start sending them notes in the chat, and they'll be able to see those. There is a second feature that is the Q&A button. And that Q&A button is a particularly good way for you to submit a question. If you're interested in getting a private response, if you want to direct something to a panelist, perhaps who spoke earlier in the session and who hasn't yet, and maybe we've moved on, but you want to direct a question to them. So that option does exist as well. And so want to make sure that everyone is aware of those options for communication. Depending on how we're doing for time, there may also be opportunities for us to open up microphones and allow people to contribute questions and comments. But to be clear, as I have mentioned a few times, we have discovered that it can feel very lonely to be presenting to your screen. And so certainly we want to encourage people to use the chat function to note things that seem especially important to you, to make comments, supportive comments, of course, but also to ask questions even as the presenter is working. Please feel free to do all of that. So I think that takes care of the formalities of the business for this webinar. But let me take a moment to introduce you to our 3 panelists this afternoon. First up, we have Mackenzie Mills, who is a history major here at ENC, coming to the end of her sophomore year. Mac's topic is Shaker Women, Finding Autonomy in 19th Century America. After Mac will be Marcy Zaccardi, who's presenting on her senior thesis project. The title of her essay is Reclaiming Ourselves, Contemporary Theater at the Intersection of Christian Faith and Queer Identity. And then lastly, we'll be hearing from Professor Tara Brooke Watkins in our Theater for Social Justice program. Her title is Inverting Theater of the Oppressed, Preventing Another Tulsa Race Massacre. So really excited to hear all 3 of these papers, and glad to have our panelists here with us today. But without any further ado, Mac, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. All right. The 19th century was a period of drastic religious change in America, beginning with Protestant republicanism and transitioning into the 20th century with a much more pluralist and diverse religious makeup. Many denominations splintered and divided over theological and secular issues varying from sanctification to slavery. One sect that remained largely unchanged since its introduction to America in the 1770s is the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, otherwise known as the Shakers. Centered in towns they based around communal property, celibacy, and simplicity, the Shakers maintained their way of life throughout the 19th century, although they began the century as radical outsiders and ended it as outdated traditionalists. One central tenet of Shakerism is the belief that all humans are equal in the eyes of God, which offered a distinction from secular, in this context meaning non-Shaker, American society. Many women took advantage of Shaker communities, with as many as 72% of Shakers being women by the end of the 19th century and 88% by the 1930s. The Shakers provided women with more say in their future than their mainstream American counterparts during the 19th century by providing more religious recognition, bodily autonomy, and opportunities regarding labor and intellect. The Shakers began in England during the mid-18th century with Mother Ann Lee, a working-class woman who joined a group of Quaker enthusiasts. Mother Ann Lee and some of her followers came to the American colonies in the mid-1770s and settled in New York. They eventually established towns as far west and south as Kentucky, but mostly concentrated in the American Northeast. At their peak in the mid-19th century, the Shakers had around 4,000 members among 60 quasi-isolated communities. The Shakers saw an increase in membership during the 1830s and 1840s as some Americans began to move away from conventional family structures and gender roles. However, industrialization and westward expansion ultimately ended the trend and began a decline in membership. The population dropped to 855 by 1900, and there are only 2 remaining Shakers as of 2017. Shakers, despite their rich religious and cultural history, are most well known for the material goods they produced, like baskets and brooms to fund their societies. The distinction and power dynamic between Shaker men and women reveal Shakers' place in secular America. Shakers, in keeping with Quaker traditions of eschewing worldly titles, refer to each other as brother and sister, with the only distinction being between elders and the rest of the community. Men still tended to have more power than women, although professing total equality within Shaker communities. As separate as Shakers attempted to be from the flaws of secular America, the majority of Shakers came from the outside world. They were born and raised in non-Shaker families with non-Shaker beliefs and values, so they carried those experiences with them when they joined Shaker communities. Shakers reject both marriage and sexual relations, meaning that very few children were born Shaker. Without a renewable population to raise on Shaker ideals, secular influence was always a present reminder of how unusual the Shakers were. Shaker beliefs and practices offered a more prominent place for women than other faith communities. Mother Ann Lee is not regarded as God herself, but is largely viewed as his second coming in the female part of his manhood. In other words, she served as the second appearance of God's Spirit on earth and as a Christ figure without being a deity. Mother Ann Lee may not have been a physical manifestation of God, but the Shakers did believe that God held both masculine and feminine traits and virtues. This may not have greatly impacted Shaker women in their day-to-day lives, but representation of any kind, especially in religious tradition, can be formative on theology and personal connection. Even in the modern church, theologians who approach Christianity with a feminist perspective or refer to God with female or non-gendered language are seen as unusual. In further keeping with their emphasis on equality, Shakers do not recognize pastors or religious leaders within their communities. Shaker elders served as leadership for most facets of life, but religious services were a collaborative effort. Thus, Shaker women were given more agency within the church in their own religious experiences than other Protestant women, even though they did not have formal positions of influence. The communal nature of ordered worship and Shaker life in general allowed women this freedom. Freed from the responsibilities of raising children and maintaining a household, women had more time and energy to devote to religious study and involvement. In a society where work was viewed as a form of worship, it is important to note that women did serve as community leaders. After Mother Ann Lee's death in 1784, Shaker leadership passed on to 2 male leaders before Mother Lucy Wright became the last central figure of Shakerism in 1796. A ministry of several elders has served as the denominational leadership since 1821 and has included numerous women alongside men. While Shaker women served in both local and denominational leadership roles, they were typically less powerful than their male counterparts, at least until the end of the 19th century. Still, women in larger American society did not serve so consistently in public leadership positions until the 20th century. Even without clear pastoral and ministerial roles, Shaker women exercised a larger influence over their own religious practice than their secular contemporaries. The communal nature of Shaker services allowed them to be more involved than simply attending a service led by male staff. Shaker communities encouraged collaboration and worship in all aspects of life, treating each brother or sister as an individual with equally important spiritual needs and contributions. The elevation of women to community leaders, shaping both religious and institutional practices, reveals the willingness of Shaker communities to listen to women and recognize them as authority figures. It can also be argued that female representation in Shaker history and theology served as a point of access for women in what was and remains a male-dominated discipline. Shaker ideals of gender equality began, as most Shaker ideology does, with Mother Ann Lee. Although she was married before clearly establishing Shaker practices, Mother Ann Lee viewed marriage as an institution of bondage for women, where they were expected to be subordinate to their husbands. The Shakers were living in what they claimed to be a new dispensation of regeneration and perfection, where Christ's return to earth was fully realized by Mother Ann Lee as the female counterpart to Christ, and so marriage and other earthly institutions were no longer necessary. Despite these attempts at equality, female Shakers appeared less happy and healthy than male Shakers, according to some visitors, hinting at some remaining inequality. The Shaker rejection of marriage was an important marker for gender equality because it removed the pressure on women to find economic and social stability through a husband. In the rest of America, marriage was a fundamental part of life for working and middle-class women. Beyond rejecting marriage, Shakers based their society on total celibacy in order to combat sexual sin. From a young age, Mother Ann Lee had a great light and conviction concerning the sinfulness and depravity of human nature, and especially concerning the lusts of the flesh, which she often made known to her parents. She viewed any lust or sexual relation as sinful in nature, and saw this perspective validated when she lost all of her children in infancy. If the Shakers were living in a more perfect world ushered in by the second coming of Christ, then there was no need for sexual relations even to produce children. Religious celibacy has traditionally had a somewhat misogynist tone, placing the blame on women for being temptresses and comparing them to the Virgin Mary as the moral standard for their behavior. It is unclear if this was the thinking in Shaker communities, although they seem to have held both men and women to the same standard of sexual purity. Due to their celibate practices, the Shakers acted as a haven for women from childbirth and child rearing, especially in an age before birth control. For 19th century women, sex was a duty to be performed to both please her husband and procreate. In Orson Fowler's 1851 book, Love and Parentage, he urges women to always yield cheerfully and with a view to please him, or else the whole effect will be lost. Do all you can to conform. He does go on to address that husbands should not be forcing their wives to have intercourse, but it is still an act that must be performed for marriage to be successful. Towards the end of the 19th century, Shaker communities became a sort of refuge for single women with children, although few of them became lifelong Shakers. For many women in the 19th century who had either no inclination towards sex in general or with men, or no safe way to provide for their children, the Shakers were an attractive, stable alternative. Shaker women were not required to define themselves by their relationships with men, and were given bodily autonomy beyond those of married women living at the same time. Although a modern feminist perspective may view this as an equally flawed system for setting any sexual standard, the vast majority of Shakers joined voluntarily. These women knew the behavioral standards they agreed to uphold. Shakers and prospective Shakers also had the option to leave the community at any time, and their decisions would be supported by their Shaker family, in practice if not in feeling. Women willingly gave up their material possessions and ideas of public image in favor of a simpler life. In the sense that women could choose whether or not to become a Shaker and adopt their values, Shaker women had more influence over their lives and sexualities than non-Shakers. The most distinct differences between women in Shaker communities and the outside world were in the realms of economics, labor, and intellectual growth. Although the Shakers did not have personal property, women worked and kept financial records separate from men. If Shaker women sold a product of their labor, then the money or benefit they reaped from it would go towards the collective women rather than the whole community. This is a different take on the family economy common in the rest of the United States. The family is the Shaker community, but there is an even more specific family found among Shaker women. One set of records from the Shaker community at Mount Lebanon, New York, reveals many things about women's relationship to finances in the 19th century. The document outlines women's donations to the church community between 1828 and 1888 in both money and the monetary value of other goods like clothing and animals. In some instances, the money that came in with the women listed is not her own, but rather family money. Henry Cantrell, for example, gave money for 3 of his daughters entering the Shaker community, and Sister Mary Hazard received money from her brother. There are several entries only listed with a woman's name and a dollar amount, but there's no designation whether each woman came in with her own money or if it came from a male family member. In either case, Shaker women became part of a system where common property benefited every woman involved. Shakers were similar to the outside world in their division of labor between men and women. Each person in a Shaker community was assigned a job according to their skills, with women typically assigned to cook, clean, or educate any girls that happened to have been brought to the community. Girls brought up in Shaker communities were mainly educated in domestic trades. While these all fit into what has traditionally been the work of women, the vast majority of Shaker women came in from secular America with pre-existing skills and experiences. In order to have a functioning society, it was in the Shakers' best interest to capitalize on the jobs and skills that their members already possessed. By using a conventional approach to labor and community organization, the early Shaker community was just an enlarged colonial household. Division of labor among a group of people lessened the load on each individual. They attempted to minimize burnout, although they viewed their labor as an act of worship, by creating job rotations within areas of work. Rather than one woman doing the domestic work for her whole family, each sister and community would cover the labor so that each woman was better able to focus on worship. This system placed less pressure on Shaker women as workers and allowed them more agency as individuals. The Shakers were both conservative and progressive in their approach to women's education. Their millennial laws dictated that girls should be educated in the summer while boys were schooled in the winter. These laws also set the standards of education on trades, religion, singing, and general education classes, with subjects like law, physics, and surgery off limits to any child unless appointed by the elders. While Shaker boys trained in agricultural work and manual trades, Shaker girls gained skills in cooking, cleaning, and weaving. Some men were trained or came into Shaker communities as tailors, who made clothing for the brothers, but they typically left education and domestic work to women as long as was possible. Although education was designed to be practical according to each gender, women were equally encouraged to cultivate their intellect. Projects like The Shaker, a collaborative monthly publication printed by the Shaker community, welcomed submissions from Shaker women across the United States. Even in the first issue from 1871, the status of women is clear, from gender-inclusive language and theology to articles and stories written by women. One segment of the first edition is a dialogue aimed at attracting young adults, a format popular at the time, written by women and using female characters. A later edition of the Manifesto, as it was printed at the time, features an advertisement from the Ladies' Home Journal offering to pay for girls to attend college. This advertisement comes at a significant moment in time for higher education. The number of women enrolled in collegiate institutes in 1890 was over 56,000, and nearly 5 times as high as it had been 20 years earlier. Yet young women were outnumbered nearly 2 to 1 by young men enrolled in colleges across the country. Although there is little information that points to Shaker adults going into higher education, they certainly supported women's education by running the advertisement. While children were expected to follow gender-specific guidelines in their education, adult Shaker women were actively included in collective intellectual pursuits. This hints at a notion that while the Shakers struggled to maintain a consistent view of gender equality in other aspects of life, they remained committed when it came to intellectual opportunities. All in all, Shaker women experienced more agency in their futures than other American women. They directly influenced and contributed to religious services, stepped outside of conventional gender roles and sexual expectations, and participated in labor that was more sustainable and intellectually fulfilling than typical domestic work. Obviously, there was no singular experience for either Shaker women or non-Shaker women. There were women in more secular circles who enjoyed much more autonomy than their Shaker counterparts, just as there were women who joined Shaker communities for the traditions and strict way of life. To modern eyes, the Shakers may seem like radically traditional people, although they began as an organization fairly progressive for their time. The most vital difference in the experiences of Shaker and non-Shaker women is the element of choice. American women did not decide to be part of a society that largely hinged on their submission and delegation to the home, but Shaker women actively chose to join a community with different values. By making that decision, or having the privilege to select another course for their life, Shaker women set themselves apart from other 19th century American women of the same time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mac. That was really wonderful.
Thank you.
So if you have questions for Mac, would love to invite people to submit those in the chat, or we do even have a minute or two here. If anyone would be interested, you can raise your hand, and we can allow you to speak directly to Mac if you would like to do that. There should be a button for that. Mac, we did get one question here from an audience member who's asking about equality in education for women today. And well, basically, do you think that is remains an issue? And what are the signs that might change, if there are any?
Not having any statistics or research on modern education, given my own experience, I do not think that we've reached full equality in the American education system. I mean, a vast majority of my professors have been men, and hearing from, no offense, Dr. McCoy, and hearing
I'm
from
aware
a lot
of the fact that I am a man.
I'm sorry. Hearing from a lot of my colleagues who are in more science-oriented fields, they definitely have a lot of people who express doubt in them. Not necessarily at ENC, but I've heard many stories of professors and teachers straight up saying to female students that there's no way that they will be engineers or anything like that. And so I do think that we have a long way to go. I think we're getting there. I mean, I got into college with no problem. That it had nothing to do with the fact that I was a woman. So definitely getting there. But I do think that we have a long way to go in that regard.
Cameron asked about your interest in the Shakers and what it was that brought you to the subject of the Shakers and their roles. And somebody else just popped in asking why you thought this was an important topic. What was it that, yeah.
So last summer, my family and I were on a road trip, and because we're all nerds, we stopped at Shaker Village in Kentucky. And I certainly enjoyed it a lot. And learned a lot about the Shakers that I hadn't previously learned in any school setting. And so I really wanted to delve in and do my own research with it, because all the preconceived notions that I'd had of my education on Shakers kind of went out the window. And being a woman, I'm very interested in women's history, and so I saw this as a good opportunity to explore that side of it. As to why it's important, I think it's necessary that we look at any group in history, but specifically groups that we tend to kind of oversimplify and lump into groups,
Sure.
to look at them in their own context. So it's really easy for us to say like, oh, they were crazy, they were completely celibate, like basically lived in communes. But for what they were, they did a lot more than that. And I think it's important to try not to reduce historical people to what we think of them from our context.
Yeah, great. Dr. Nielsen has asked if you're going to sing the song Simple Gifts, which I admit I am unfamiliar with the song. So if you'd like a moment, this is your opportunity. Don't worry, there are only like 70 people listening at this moment.
Sure.
So.
Simple Gifts is a Shaker song about the simple gifts of life. And I will not be singing it for you today, but I did sing it in elementary school chorus. So you missed your chance. I'm sorry.
Oh, that is unfortunate. Good. Well, Mac, there's another question or two in the chat as well as in the Q&A box. And if I could ask you to go ahead and respond to those in the chat and in the box, I think we'll go ahead and transition to our second paper. And so thank you so much, Mac. And Marcy, the floor is yours.
All right, here we go. All right, hello. This is my senior project for my English major and my Theater for Social Justice major. So doing a little double feature here. So let's go. I'm just going to set up a timer so I know how long I'm taking. All right. So there is very little written work that tackles the intersection of Christian faith and queer identity, and even less scholarship on it. I have a particular interest in the topic, especially in the realm of theater, so I decided to use my senior project as a chance to learn more about the themes of work in this subgenre. I read 3 plays, Oblivion by Jonathan Brower, Corpus Christi by Terrence McNally, and Cardboard Piano by Hansol Jung. They each bring their own voice to the discussion, but I found a consistent theme across the works. Each play, in its own way, seeks to reclaim Christian texts and rituals, whether through actual revision or clever juxtaposition. These authors seek to make their audience think differently about the core beliefs of Christianity and how they do or don't apply to those who identify as both queer and Christian. The play Oblivion by Jonathan Brower was written to be performed in churches. It follows Tim, a man who identifies as both gay and Christian, as he tries to navigate his relationship with his faith. Tim has been through conversion therapy and struggles to reconcile his happy life with his boyfriend with the anti-gay theology he was taught. He finds out about an experimental therapy that could erase all memories of his faith, giving him a new start. The play follows his journey, culminating in him taking the pill. The ending is ambiguous, but hopeful. This play is interesting because it switches a common narrative around. Often, when someone identifies as both queer and Christian, they are told that they need to stop identifying as queer. In this story, Tim is searching for the opposite. He needs to find a way to stop identifying as Christian. His friends don't agree, however, and this is where the narrative of reclaiming shows up strongest in this play. Through their attempts to convince him not to take the pill, a new theology emerges. They have reclaimed scriptures and interpreted them in a new way. They discuss a non-affirming sermon they listened to thusly. She was speaking God's heart, just not my God. Quinn was saying we need to die to our flesh, basically surrender our sinful desires to God. But how do we interpret that as queer people? Does it mean we kill our queerness because that's how some people interpret the Bible? For Tim and I, our sin wasn't being queer, it was trying to be what we weren't, straight. And eventually, it was trying to be celibate without that calling from God. It's those harmful lies we needed to surrender. That's what needed to die. According to Simone, the character speaking, the sin of a queer and Christian identifying person is not identifying as queer, it is identifying as straight. It's lying about the self they feel is their true self. In this theology, honesty with God and others becomes vital. In the end, this is part of what drives Tim to take the pill. He has lost his ability to be honest with God and feel his love. All he can hear is the anti-gay theology he was taught. He has tried to give up identifying as queer without success, so the next natural option is trying to give up his faith. He says of anti-gay Christians, they fight so hard against our love, upholding this so-called infallible word of God, so hard for their precious infallible word of God, they miss the fact that they are assassinating our faith. How many of us will it take until they get the message? It's a miracle anyone in our community has an inclination to religion at all. Brower, who identifies as gay himself, left the church for a while, eventually returning after he had written Oblivion. His work is thought-provoking, leaving the audience with more questions than answers. Corpus Christi, by Terence McNally, is a bold reimagining of the traditional Passion play. In his version, Jesus and the disciples are portrayed as gay men. Additionally, he interweaves the traditional plot elements of a Passion play with scenes more reminiscent of a gay man's memoir or a documentary. Terence McNally pulls no punches in his quest to communicate what he believes is the true message of Jesus. When we don't love each other, we don't love God. As an adaptation of scripture, all of Corpus Christi is a reclaiming. Specifically, however, I think the purpose of the play is to reclaim the message of Jesus. Early in the play, Judas says of society, people can't stand the truth. They want their Joshua, Jesus, seen through their eyes, told through their lies. Truth is brutal. It scalds. It stings. By making Jesus explicitly pro-gay, McNally seeks to make both Christian and non-Christian audiences consider the most basic principles of Christianity and decide how they apply to queer identifying people, especially those who identify as both queer and Christian. McNally heavily emphasizes Jesus' message of love. Of people, Joshua says, we're each special, we're each ordinary, we're each divine. About prayer, not like that, on your knees, head bowed, your eyes closed. You're not afraid of him, like this, standing tall, eyes open, smiling even, your arms open to his love. At one point, 2 disciples come to him because the priests have refused to marry them. They're both men. Upon hearing the scripture the priests had used to deny them, Joshua says, why would you memorize such a terrible passage? And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. God loves us most when we love each other. In McNally's version of the Passion, Joshua is loudly pro-gay, and this is what makes him dangerous. Underscoring McNally's thoughts on the true message of Jesus are the Pharisees. Joshua repeatedly condemns their dehumanizing rhetoric, saying, you are hypocrites, you are liars, you have perverted my Father's words to make them serve your ends. I despise you, and all men who do not love all men are against me. Perhaps most memorable is the interchange between Judas and the high priest. The high priest says that Joshua's crime is blasphemy, and Judas asks, because he says he's the Son of God? The high priest responds, no, because he says you're the Son of God as well. Judas offers up Joshua's simple message. We're all the Son of God. But the high priest retorts, unless you're looking for trouble, I would keep that to myself. The Son of God is a cocksucker? I don't think so. We need sinners. This exchange highlights the specific kind of relational sin Joshua condemns in McNally's version of the Passion, namely the kind that separates humans into two categories, righteous and human, or sinner and inhuman. McNally asks his audience to consider the essence of Jesus' message, even when it might be uncomfortable. As the end of the play states, he loved every one of us. That's all he was about. Cardboard Piano by Hans Jung is an intense play. Set in northern Uganda, the first act takes place in 1999 at the height of both the attacks by the Lord's Resistance Army and the Allied Democratic Front. Two teenage girls, Chris and Adiel, stage a secret wedding in the basement of Chris's parents' missionary church and record it since they have no witnesses. They shelter a child soldier named Pika, but when he sees them kiss, he reacts violently, leaving Adiel dead and Chris grieving. In the second act, set in 2013, Chris returns to the church to find that Pika, now going by Paul, and his new wife are now pastoring there. She confronts Paul about his actions all those years ago and his continued exclusion of queer people, namely Adiel's cousin Francis. There are no easy answers, and the play ends as it begins, with the recording of Chris and Adiel's wedding. This entire play takes place in a church. Hans Jung is clearly making sure that the audience thinks about everything in this play, especially its strong queer themes, through its connection to Christianity. The three elements I will focus on are the use of just as I am, the wedding scene, and Paul's sermon. For those who might not know, Just as I Am is a hymn in which the author affirms that God accepts each believer just as they are, because Jesus' blood was shed for them. Juxtaposed with the play's themes of queerness and the limits of forgiveness, this is thought-provoking, to say the least. It both begins and ends the play, so it is clearly an intentional choice. With her dual focus on queerness and atrocities committed in war, Jung seems to be asking the audience which sins they think are too heinous to be forgiven by God, which dark blots are too dark to be cleansed by grace. And if the answer is none, where does that leave them? The wedding scene is one of the more explicit instances of reclaiming a ritual of the church I found in this project. In this scene, Chris actively edits the wedding vows to fit her own experience of identifying as both queer and Christian. She says, strike lawful, strike according to God's holy ordinance, and strike the second part of this whole section. We are not endowing anything in the name of the Father, the Son, or the Holy Ghost, because they don't care. Amen should go too. Her way of reclaiming the right of marriage is to make it more secular, distancing it from the Trinity because they don't care. Adiel, however, has the opposite approach. For her, it is essential that they perform the vows exactly as they are traditionally done. It is even important to her to call Chris her husband, even though they are both women. When Chris protests, Adiel says, "What, we have two wives then? That is a house of widows." She is equally convinced that God is not disapproving of their wedding, but her way of expressing her intersecting experiences is completely opposite of Chris's. I find this scene particularly fascinating in my research because it shows that while people who identify as queer and Christian feel a similar need to make Christian rituals their own, they can often differ dramatically in how they put that desire into practice. The last element I would like to discuss is the Pastor Paul's sermon in Act 2. It opens the act, so it is clearly an important element in Jung's mind. His sermon is focused on the Good Samaritan. A commonly preached parable, it is the story of a man beaten by robbers who was avoided by two church leaders and eventually helped by a Samaritan, a person generally judged and shunned by the populace. In his sermon, he asks the familiar question, "Who is my neighbor?" This is an interesting choice of sermon, especially juxtaposed with his treatment of Francis later in the act. Despite Francis desiring a place in the church, he is denied it because of his homo ways. The most interesting use of this sermon topic, though, is near the end of the act. After Paul is stopped from attacking Chris, he starts his sermon again, like a memory exercise, according to Jung. However, this time, it isn't the same, and Paul's inner struggles begin bleeding into his sermon. When describing the Samaritan, he calls him somebody that we all hate, somebody we believe is a bad man, but then wonders aloud, who is the bad man? His last lines in the show, spoken to Chris, are, "You are a joke. This church is a joke. Everything is still broken." And you, his wife, leads him away before he can finish. I believe Jung intended Paul to be a tribute to the dissonance between Christian teachings and the way some Christians respond to queer people, especially those seeking faith. But I think it can also be a critique of how harshly some people judge Christians who are trying to love people but doing so imperfectly. By holding up the story of the Good Samaritan so prominently, she lets the question ring unanswered. Who is my neighbor? The intersection of queer identity and Christian faith in theater is a fascinating look at what defines our religion, what parts are essential and what parts melt away under scrutiny. How important is love versus strong adherence to doctrine? All of these works leave us thinking. They are thoughtful and carefully crafted offerings to the field of theater. I come away from them with a greater appreciation of Jesus and the way he loved. I think it is important to listen to all types of voices in this conversation about God. He's hard to pin down, and so the more angles we can see him from, the closer I think we'll get to his true message. Thank you guys, and just before I end, I'd like to give a special thank you to the professors who helped me get here, specifically Dr. Karen Hank, Dr. Mariana Quinchipapa, and Professor Tara Brooke-Watkins. I wouldn't be the well-rounded and educated person I am today without your support and guidance. Any questions?
Thank you, Marcy. Great work. I would open the floor for people who might like to submit a question in the chat, or who might even want to speak to Marcy. If you raise your hand, we can make that possible. Marcy, there is a question here about how you arrived sort of at these specific plays. Was there something that, I mean, you talked a little bit about the traits that they share, but I don't actually know for myself if they represent a larger body of literature, or what was it that specifically led you to these three?
Yeah, I actually did a lot of Google searching is the answer, a lot of tracking down, because the thing is, there's a lot of plays that deal with queer themes, and there's a lot of plays that deal with Christian themes, and there's a larger body that have both Christian and queer characters in them, but there was actually these are honestly three of the only plays I could track down that had people who identified both as queer and as Christian. Like, there was literally another book that I bought because I was like, oh, and then there were Christian characters and queer characters, and it didn't overlap at all. So yeah, it's hard to find them. This is not like, and if there's a very large body of work, I couldn't find it by Google searching.
I wouldn't anticipate that there's a large body of literature out there on this. So yeah, great. That we did get another question in the chat here. Can you see these plays and your work helping others who struggle with entering in a religious community while identifying as part of the LGBTQ community as well?
I mean, that's always the hope. I would hope that queer people feel welcome in, even if people don't 100% agree. Like, I would hope that we could make spaces more welcoming to people who feel like they identify as both.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Nielsen also has asked whether you're interested in contributing to this body of literature, doing some sort of play of your own that would explore these themes. Is there anything else to be said on this subject, Marcy, or is the book pretty well closed on it?
I think there's definitely more to say, and I actually am working on a play that it was originally supposed to be presented this semester, but then COVID happened, so it's going to be put up sometime next year. But yes, I'm writing an adaptation of Pilgrim's Progress, but seen through the lens of someone who identifies as both queer and Christian, and seeing how that lines up to the, normal Pilgrim's Progress Christian walk sort of allegory.
Yeah, great. Well, Marcy, thank you so much for walking us through that and these through some challenging material, and appreciate your thoughtfulness in doing that. We are going to go ahead and transition over to Tara, but Marcy, there are a couple other questions in the Q&A boxes for you if you'd like to take a crack at answering people there as well. But otherwise, Tara, the floor is yours, and we've saved you all kinds of time. So,
thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone. I want to start really by just saying I feel really honored to be a part of this particular session. And Mac and Marcy, I'm like so kind of into your presentations, I'm forgetting like what I'm supposed to present on right now. So well done. And I'd love to converse with both of you later about these awesome topics. So, well, I'm going to jump right in. The name of my presentation is called Inverting Theater of the Oppressed, Preventing Another Tulsa Race Massacre. And I just want to kind of start by showing you the kind of just basic pathway we're going to take as I address this topic today. So there's kind of our map, and I do want to also add, maybe I say this a little bit defensively as a professor, these slides are slightly text heavier than I would encourage any student, but I also know that these are supposed to be available for people who can't see the presentations, so I wanted to make sure that everything was clear for anybody who might want to go back and reference these or look at these without hearing me. So I want to start today with my basic argument. So I am arguing today that Augusto Boal's Theater of the Oppressed practices could be more helpful than they currently are in shifting general whites toward blacks treatment in America if theater artists were to invert his premise. By looking at the historical event of the Tulsa Race Massacre through the lens of theater and using references of blacks in America, who have long felt that their relationship with whites resemble that of performer and audience, I will argue that theater artists should work to develop new theater of the oppressed exercises based on listening to Black voices in Tulsa and at ENC. In America, it is not the oppressed who must rebel. It is the oppressor who must experience the oppressed's daily walk. Therefore, I am proposing an inverted theater of the oppressed that places oppressors on stage in the position of the performer. So let me start just with the Tulsa Race Massacre. Many of you know that this is a topic near and dear to my heart. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. My grandparents lived very near where this event happened, and I had never heard about it all growing up in Tulsa. It was the largest, originally called the Race Riot, one of the largest race riots in the history of America. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the history of this because I have spoken about it, and my focus is not so much on the history today, but I encourage you to look this up to get as much information as possible. It is well recorded. But the basic kind of definition of this event, it was a white-led destruction of 35 blocks of the Black town in Tulsa, Oklahoma called Greenwood. It was nicknamed Black Wall Street by Booker T. Washington when he visited there. And this event happened May 31st to June 1st, 1921. So in about a year, we will be hitting the centennial of this event. The key concept I want to focus on today is the border of the two major railroad tracks, which are still there today, surrounded Greenwood. And according to survivors, Blacks knew they were going to lose the defense of that neighborhood that night as soon as the whites crossed the tracks into Greenwood. And still today, people reference that, you know, I mean, it feels kind of metaphorical to most of us, the kind of crossing the tracks. But in Tulsa, crossing the tracks still means literally going into like the segregated area, right? I'm either going into the Black community or I'm going into the white community. And when I started this research, one of the women that I worked with said, I'm still nervous about crossing those tracks sometimes because of what the white people did to us in Tulsa in 1921. So this history is still living and breathing there today. I'm gonna show you a clip from the very beginning of the first episode of HBO's Watchmen. And this is kind of exciting that after years of research, there's actually something that has been filmically done now about this story. So if you haven't seen Watchmen, it aired at HBO this winter, and I do recommend it if you're interested in this history and cultural trauma and how something 100 years ago is still reverberating in communities today. So I will also warn you, some of the images in this clip can be difficult to see. And as somebody who has been researching this and studying photographs and survivor accounts, I'm really actually pretty proud of the Hollywood industry with this quick clip, because everything that they're showing is very well documented. They're not making anything up. So let's take a minute and see this. We'll go ahead and stop there. Again, everything you see is pretty well documented. Planes dropped bombs. There were people with machine guns. People looted businesses, looted homes. White women took photographs of what was happening. White women sold things from Black homes. I mean, this is just a horrific event. After the Oklahoma Guard came in, like at about noon on June 1st, they actually rounded up all of the Black survivors and then put them in internment camps. I mean, this is really just a horrific history that many people don't know about. So my project, actually, when I went to Tulsa, was to look at how theater could intervene or, you know, have some effect on a community experiencing cultural trauma and historical trauma. So I ran story circles, I did applied theater activities, I attended performance events, and then the kind of final culmination was to write a play, which is called Tulsa 21 Black Wall Street, telling the story and juxtaposing it with current events going on to try to show how the Black community is feeling. This image here that you're seeing is just a quick image to show you what those 35 blocks looked like, all the hash marks there. That's everything that was destroyed in downtown Tulsa. And just to put it in some sort of geographical comparison for yourselves, if you are a Quincyite or looking at ENC, I just mapped out the same amount of space that would be destroyed starting in the middle of our campus on Eastern Nazarene College today. So if you can picture Sachem Street in the middle of ENC's campus, all the way to Billings Road and about a block from the shore, that's about how much land we're talking overnight was burned to the ground. So just to give you some perspective. And I'm going to skip these photos for time, since you saw the clip. I'm going to put Tulsa on pause for a second and jump to our next kind of crucial concept to understand my argument today. And this is the concept of the Black mask, or enforced performativity. So enforced performativity, I'm defining this as when an outside group socially polices another group to the point of the policed group resorting to performance for survival. The key concept I want to make clear is that historically, Black writers, as early as in the slave narratives, referenced the need to, quote, wear the mask around white people. And the mask is a quintessential symbol of performing and theatricality, right? It goes all the way back to Greek theater and Japanese theater. And in many African cultures, the mask is also seen as a physical conduit for another, usually a spirit. And in Yoruba culture, the Ngungun, the ancestor, actually comes through the mask and speaks through the body of the Black performer. So when Black writers are referencing the fact that they're wearing a mask in order to survive, this is close to what James Hatch is actually referring to as and neo-Africanism, right? Something that's been carried over from Africa and brought into America, but also that it is a need to perform so that white people actually don't even know what's really going on in the Black spirit. And I think Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem, Why We Wear the Mask Here, talks very pointedly towards this concept. So if you haven't read it, it's there for you to come back and reference, or you can easily look it up. And I'm not going to get into all these references and writers, but I just put those out there so that you can see how many writers from pre-Civil War are talking about the fact that they feel watched by white people. They feel like they have to perform. They feel like they're wearing a mask. They feel like they're scrutinized to the point that they have to change their behavior. So if we can concede that in America, Black people are feeling watched and like they're performing, then we need to see them as if they are on stage, okay? And this is where the concept of the fourth wall comes in. And if you're unfamiliar with this concept, I want you to just imagine that there's a room on stage, right? There's a set, maybe a living room. And ideally, right, the idea of a room, typical room, has four walls. The people in the room on stage believe there are four walls to it because they're supposed to be in the room. But if there was actually a fourth wall, that's the space between the audience and the stage, the audience wouldn't be able to see the show. So the fourth wall is not really a wall at all. It is imaginary. The key concept, as I talk about the fourth wall, is that there is a respect of the fourth wall in theater, and that is a silent negotiation between audience and actor, okay? So in other words, every time you come to see a show, as an audience member, you are hoping, and I'm not saying we fully respect this anymore in the world of theater, but as an audience member, you're hoping or assuming the actors are not going to jump off the stage, right? They're not going to break that fourth wall, and they're not going to come and hound audience members. And of course, when that happens, it's experimental theater, right? It's not traditional theater anymore. The other part of that negotiation is that audience members are not supposed to cross the fourth wall and go attack the actors, right? Every time an actor walks on stage, there is this basic assumption that they're going to be safe on that stage from the audience. So here's a couple of images that just maybe visually bring you into what the fourth wall is. It's a little hard to show breaking the fourth wall in an image because it might just look like an actor's looking out. So I found this visual art representation to be a little bit maybe easier to understand what it means to break the fourth wall. But when we talk about breaking the fourth wall, again, that's really referring to an actor who decides to pretend like that wall isn't there and actually looks right at the audience and talks to them, right? Or maybe jumps out and has a conversation with you in the audience. So we're gonna move back to Tulsa here for a second, and communities, and specifically Black communities in America, because Black people are saying they feel watched. There must be, I'm wondering, right, where the fourth wall is in these communities. And I am arguing that there is a false security of a fourth wall border that is felt in Black communities. So I'm kind of defining the fourth wall border in life as this physical boundary that doubles as a border for space that convinces groups on either side that it is uncrossable. And I put quick examples: hedgerow, stone wall, fence, street, sidewalk. So, you know, I mean, I'm looking at my neighbor's house across the street right now, and it has a small fence, and I'm pretty sure I'm not supposed to go over into their yard, right? That's a border, but I also know intellectually I could jump it if I decided to, right? But we feel like just putting up a boundary keeps us safe, just like an actor would feel if they're on stage. And then the key concept I'm pulling from performance studies scholars Harvey Young and Ramon H. Rivera-Severa, who state that a border transforms space into place and creates the policing of bodies, okay? So again, if I'm looking at my neighbor's yard, if there was no fence, right, if it's just an open yard, it's space, but as soon as I put a fence there, now it's a yard. Now it's become something else. And I can kind of look over there and wonder what's happening behind that border. I mean, how many times we talk about like the gossipy neighbors, right? We're always kind of looking over. So even that's like a policing of sorts. So my argument here is that a fourth wall border, right, creates this feeling of having an audience and a performer. And I'm arguing that what happened in Tulsa is that the train tracks, which I mentioned earlier, served as a fourth wall border for the community. So I just want to kind of go back and forth between these photos for a second. So this photo is a historical photo of Black Wall Street. So this intersection that you're looking at is Greenwood Ave and Archer Street. And this is the kind of heart, if you will, of Black Wall Street, where 600 businesses started and lined the streets before 10,000 white people crossed the railroad tracks and burned it to the ground. The picture you're seeing here is a picture I took in 2018, and it is from the other angle. So again, I'm standing kind of here and looking at the rest of downtown Tulsa. That railroad track, and you can see the train, is still used. And I've got to tell you, I mean, when you're standing there and that train goes by, and it goes by 2 to 3 times a day, it feels like a wall, right? And it feels like I can't cross that thing. So, and yet you intellectually know I could step over railroad tracks. So it's a fourth wall border, and it gives a false sense of safety. I really believe that in Tulsa, because Black Wall Street was so self-sufficient, they didn't need the help of white people. They were known as a, you know, very close-knit community, nationally known, right? I mean, this is like Tulsa was really important to Black people across the country. I pulled up 2 images of Tulsa Star editions that were released in 1915 and 1918. So the Tulsa Star was the Black newspaper of Greenwood, and you can see the one on the left that mentions 62 lynchings during 1918. This article is of course, very outspoken against lynchings, but also pretty proud of the fact that lynchings have not happened in Tulsa, and white people feel like they can't. It's a sign that white people feel like they can't get to us, right? And you know, I bring up the second one because it feels really, if you look at the Tulsa Star editions, which are available on oklahomahistory.org, so you can look more up if you're interested. But they really kind of go back and forth between, let's talk about everything that's happening negatively towards Black people in America, and let's talk about how great everything is in Tulsa. So you know, when I created the play, and there's a kind of dialogic piece pulled out there for you to look at, but I really do use this as the premise for why it's very possible that that this happened in Tulsa, and that's not to say I'm putting ownership in any way on the Black community, but they know they're being watched. They talk about being watched nationally, but they feel that there's going to always be this kind of theatrical respect of the fourth wall border. And so let's now talk about how in the world theater of the oppressed has anything to do with this. So for those of you who are not familiar with this concept, theater of the oppressed is a theory developed by social justice activist and theater artist Augusto Boal, Brazilian theater artist. And he develops this theory and then uses it to create activities and forms of theater that help the oppressed stand up against oppression. And one of his kind of famous quotes is, "Theater is not safe," right? So a lot of his activities, if you're in the theater world, people are doing these activities all over the world in theater. Drama therapy uses them. I mean, I've done them in classes before. People have created companies around the concept of theater of the oppressed. So it's a big deal, and it still is kind of the only approach we have towards addressing oppression and oppressor, right? Or oppressed and oppressor. So the basic premise, and I'll give you a little bit of background here. So the basic premise is that Greek theater, this is what Boal believes, Greek theater and traditional theater practices, and by traditional theater practices, I mean you come, you watch a show, you go home, right? Have led to the oppressed in communities remaining oppressed. Theater practices, therefore, should play a role in activating revolt against oppression. So one of his big beliefs is that the oppressor has learned to remain silent against oppressors, and they need to be activated to rebel, right? They've got to be taught that there's something they can do about their situation. So how in the world does Greek theater have anything to do with why we're oppressed 400 years later, right? This is the basic idea. In Greek tragedy, there's always a character, which is called the Greek chorus. And the Greek chorus is supposed to represent in the play the citizens of the community. And in Greek tragedy, any violence that happens off stage, it is not seen by the audience. So, Medea kills her children. Oedipus gouges his eyes out, right? This is all happening off stage. Chorus remains on stage, watches the tragedy off stage for us, and then tells us what's going on and tells us what they feel about what they see. And usually the Greek chorus is like, the lines that these chorus members have, they're falling apart having to see this, but they're not doing anything about it, right? And I mean, even in Medea, right, she tells the chorus, I'm gonna go kill my children. And they're like, no, and she leaves, and they stay on stage and they talk about how the fact that they don't know, like, they can't believe she's gonna do this, but nobody leaves the stage to go stop her. So the audience has learned, this is Boal's premise, right? The audience has learned to watch violence and do nothing, okay? And so I'm not gonna take a ton of time to explain these two forms of theater for time, but look them up. But his two huge forms of theater are forum theater and invisible theater. And again, he believes that if you're sitting in the audience, you are the oppressed, and you have learned to watch the play and do nothing. And that is pretty standard theater, right? So his forms of theater are training audience members to actually stop the show and come into the play and change it. Okay. And he believes that you will leave as an audience member and start seeing, like, apply this idea to life and see what's happening. If you see tragedy, right? It's the see something, say something thing. So when I am jumping to the theater of the oppressed for Blacks in America, as I was in Tulsa, hearing people in the story circles talk over and over and over again, they would have comments that just did not sit in what I understood as, like, pressed response through theater, because Boal he's it, right? He's kind of the guy. And so I've just pulled some quotes here, but I mean, many comments of, like, we've tried over and nothing has be white people actually understanding what to do to be different. People kept saying to me, when you write this play, you've got to show white people how they act. Like, they don't get it unless you show it to them. And in talking about theater of the oppressed with a woman at my church, I love this quote. She says, I'm tired of people telling me to rebel. We've rebelled for years. And so the idea that theater of the oppressed is asking the oppressed to rebel instead of asking the oppressor to change, right? Like, that's where I struggle. And what we're talking about, this community in Tulsa that has been 100 years oppressed over and over and over again. I mean, their land has literally been taken away, like, almost every 20 years, bits of it are taken away from them. So if they're saying we need something different to change, and it's got to be white people, I've got to listen to that, right? And I think a lot of times our tendency as white people is to hear complaints from Black people and be like, oh my gosh, like, what is wrong? I'm tired of hearing this. Like, I hear all the time, like, stop picking the scab. And we've got to stop having defensive reactions. Okay. But if we can't get to that place of just, like, stopping the defensive response, then something else has to kind of get to us, right? I love this last quote: white people won't get it until they get it. So the question is, how do we get white people to get it, if this is what the Black community is asking for? And this is where an inverted theater of the oppressed performance comes in, okay? So again, Augusto Boal is saying the oppressed is sitting in the audience and they need to step in to change what's happening on stage. What I am suggesting is that the oppressor step into the experience of what our oppressed community, Black people in America, are saying they feel, and they feel watched. They feel scrutinized. They feel like they have to perform, and they feel like they're not themselves. So my question is, what would it feel like, and I guess I'm speaking to white people right now, what would it feel like to go to a show and you are the one who is being watched? Now, I have not done this, okay? And I would love to do it at some point. But I want you to just imagine for a second that you've gotten a ticket to a show, right? And when you get to the theater, they're actually ushering you in through the backstage door. And when you go in, you're on the stage, right? And you're not in the audience. And you can't see the audience because the lights are blinding you. So, you're standing on the stage and you're not sure what's going on. Maybe you look around and you notice everybody else on stage is also white, and you're like, okay, maybe you recognize that, maybe you don't. And in this weird discomfort, suddenly you start to hear comments from the audience who you can't see about you, about how you were dressed, about what you're saying, about how you're saying it, about how your hair is styled, about who you're talking to, and maybe how you're wearing your clothes, not even just what you're wearing, but how you're wearing them. And maybe it's funny at first, and maybe it's uncomfortable, but I suggest, and again, it's a theory, haven't done it yet, but I suggest that if this show were not to end anytime soon, and you had to stay on stage and be watched and scrutinized and critiqued for a long time, maybe even just for that show experience, right? Maybe even just for that evening, you would start to shift your behavior a little bit because you don't want to be talked about that way. That's just a glimpse, I'm suggesting, of what Black people are saying they have felt for years, right? And we've still not changed our behavior despite the fact that they have told us about this. So we've got to do something to help people feel it, since hearing it is not enough. And just in case you are thinking, well, Terry, you did this in Tulsa, and these writers are people from, mid-19th to mid-20th century. I was so curious to see if this was still an experience now, and an experience in a very different location than Tulsa, that I actually ran story circles with students of color at ENC 2 years ago. And I asked, right, like, do you feel like you're performing even here on our campus? Do you, and how are you performing? And I asked, like, what would you say to white people about what we need to do differently if I was to create some sort of theater activity? So I want to share with you some of the comments that they made. And again, this is within our own community. It would be nice to have white people understand that we have different hats. We have to wear different hats and perform. We have to try harder than them. I feel like the awkward person sitting in the corner at a party when I go to class. I really don't think I isolate myself. It's like there's something about me that just makes people feel like they need to be on the other side of the room from me. So again, creating that weird distance and another fourth wall border. I have to make it look like I'm not okay when I'm not. If I'm not always smiling, it's not okay. If I'm not entertaining, it's not okay. It is suffocating to not be who I am. Are you kidding me? I feel like I have to smile all the time. It's the only way I'll be accepted. White people can make the stereotypes and judgments, but people of color can't respond to correct it because that's not okay. We have to censor ourselves. As a Black male, I have to perform better than everyone else if I'm even going to be noticed. I am performing just for acceptance. I have to perform against your stereotype. I wish white people understood that they're just their body language toward me. Just they pull their heads back and they glare like they're silently judging you. Just that alone makes me feel like I'm doing something wrong. White people need to see a reflection of themselves. Like, I really don't think they get it. And this is reflective of that same comment in Tulsa. White people won't get it until they get it. So I've suggested a form of theater. It follows an inverted theater of the oppressed practice. But Boal's work is just forms of theater. It's lots of exercises that people can go through to have little experiences. So I took these comments and created, just in my mind, an inverted theater of the oppressed activity, right? Or a couple of activities. So the idea of a mirror is very common in theater games. And so I'm suggesting something called a white mirror. So two actors have to mirror each other, but the acts that they have to perform are white performative acts, and they can't steer from those, right? They have to perform those acts. The forced smile, right? We hear a lot, if we're talking about the black mask, this idea that you always have to have this smile on your face. How long can you maintain a smile? And there's various activities that could be created around just this idea. There's no winner. And then finally, the performance competition, right? So this idea that I'm a black person, but I'm always having to perform better than my white peers. Two or more actors perform an activity, but based on audience responses, they have to keep outperforming the other until the audience is satisfied. There is no winner. So in conclusion, I ask, would this have a bold effect, right? Would it help us prevent white on black violence, right? And let's not pretend like that's not still happening, okay? It may not look like a Tulsa race massacre that is destroying 35 blocks of people, but it might look like the fact that we have 35 black men a year die from police violence, right? We are still experiencing that. And nobody, I think, wants to believe that they themselves would get to a violent act, but we've got to intervene somehow before we even get to that position. We've got to change the perspective of race and race relations in this country. And I just close with this final quote. This is from a Story Circle participant. So when we talked about what the play could look like, and the idea of like, you've got to change white people, she said, changing how white people see us? Oh, you'd make history if you could do that. So thank you so much for listening. And I will stop there with my long overtime presentation, but I appreciate everybody's attention. Thank you.
Thanks, Tara. There's a ton to chew on here. I would encourage people, obviously we are just about out of time, but I would encourage people to submit questions in the Q&A box for Tara. We do have a question that Cameron wanted to get on top of and got into the chat right away, Tara. Okay. Asking about whether you think this is the proposal you're making is uniquely situated when it comes to questions of black and white people, or if it would apply equally to those in other oppressed communities as well.
Yeah, I love it. Yes, 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 yes. So that's my answer. Yes. I will say the activities I'm specifically hinting at or developing are coming from research with Black people specifically. So Augusto Boal has a great book called Games for Non-Theater People, and he's got it developed into categories. And I would say, you know, if I were really to pursue this and hopefully post-dissertation defense, I will, I would love to think through like a book where there are categories of different oppressed and oppressor situations. But absolutely, absolutely. I think that any oppressor should understand what the oppressed is going through in order to know how they're coming across and how they can change. So absolutely.
Nick asked Tara, whether is there any particular form of theater in which people from an oppressing group are compelled to identify with historical characters who committed an oppression? In other words, that they are trying to see, they're compelled to sort of see a reflection of themselves.
There is nothing immediately coming to mind, but that does not mean that's not out there. And I appreciate the history and theater intersection question there, Nick. But yeah, so let me just, is that in the Q&A?
It is, okay. Yeah.
So I'll look at that question more clearly instead of just hearing it and see if, sure. But yeah, and I'll let you know if there's something that comes to mind. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Well, Tara, thank you, and Marcy and Mac, thanks to you as well, and to all of you who've been in the audience with us. Some incredibly challenging ideas to think through here in this panel. So grateful for all of you. And there is another, a final session of the Academic Symposium that will start at 4 o'clock. And so you can find the link to that session on the homepage on Canvas, and hope that you will be able to join us there. So thanks, everybody.